I had always wanted to camp alone, just me and the wild. There was something about being out in nature with no one around that felt freeing. So, when I found a spot deep in a forest I had never visited before, I figured it was the perfect place for some peace and quiet. I packed up my stuff, drove out there, and hiked into the woods until I found a clearing that felt just right. The trees were thick, and there wasn't another soul in sight. It was exactly what I had been looking for. As the sun began to set, I set up my tent and got a fire going. I sat by the fire, cooking some food and enjoying the stillness of the forest. I felt at ease, happy to be away from everything. After dinner, I let the fire die down and went into my tent, zipping it up tight. The night had gotten darker, and the stars were bright above the trees. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest. At first, it was calming, but after a while, I started to hear something else. It sounded like a soft snapping sound, like sticks breaking. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just some animal moving around, but the snapping grew louder, closer. It sounded like footsteps, someone or something was circling my campsite. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped. I went outside and nobody was there, and I was really confused. I thought it was probably some animal looking for food. After going inside again, I fell asleep. When I woke up, I could hear the footsteps again, but they were really slow. It sounded like they tried to make as little noise to wake me up. It sounded like two people were there, searching for something. Now I was 100% sure those aren't some animals. The worst thing is that I didn't have any weapon, didn't have any phone to call someone, and also I was alone in this forest. I knew I had to do something. I decided I would make a small noise to scare them off. After there was 10 seconds of dead silence, then I heard fast-paced footsteps. Whoever they are, they tried to run away. I lay there for a long time, and I was wondering, who were those people? Why were they near my tent in the middle of the night? I didn't know, and that made it worse. The thought of going back to sleep seemed impossible, but I forced myself to stay in the tent until the first light of morning broke through the trees. As soon as the sun came up, I packed up my things, and all I wanted was to get out of that forest. This wasn't the peaceful trip that I hoped for. While I was leaving, I was always on alert, always looking over my shoulder. Now I know where I shouldn't camp anymore. I love to go camping every weekend since I look at it like a break from my job. So I picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any town, where I wouldn't run into another person for miles. It was the perfect place to camp alone, or so I thought. After hours of hiking, I finally found a good spot to set up camp. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and sat by the flames, enjoying the silence. It felt peaceful. Before heading to bed, I needed to pee, so I grabbed a flashlight and wandered a little ways from the tent. As I stood there, staring into the darkness, something caught my eye. Far in the distance, through the trees, I saw a faint glow. At first, I thought maybe it was a trick of the light, but then I noticed it was moving. Slowly, the glowing light drifted through the trees, like it was floating just above the ground. At first, I was confused. I don't think other campers come here often. Maybe they got lost on their way, but it was also very late for anyone to be walking in the forest in late hours. All of a sudden, the glow stopped, vanishing into the blackness. I finished up quickly and hurried back to the tent, but for some reason, I couldn't sleep now. Something was making me nervous. The night passed without any other strange occurrences, but I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I could hear something out there, moving through the trees. I couldn't imagine that my peaceful weekend would turn up like this. When morning finally came, I decided to explore the area a bit before packing up. The forest felt different in the daylight. As I walked through the woods, I stumbled upon something I hadn't noticed the day before. A cabin. It was tucked away, hidden behind a thick wall of trees and overgrown bushes. The cabin looked old, abandoned. But what really unsettled me were the bones scattered around the front of the cabin. Animal bones, some small, some large, littered the ground as if something had been dragging them here. Also, the smell was horrible. I needed to get away as soon as possible. That was enough for me. I turned around and headed straight back to camp. As soon as I reached my tent, I packed up my things and decided that it's time to leave. I go camping every single weekend, but I never had experience even similar to this. Me and my friends were looking forward this camping trip for a while. We had all the gear packed and a perfect spot deep in the woods picked out. It was going to be an adventure. We set out early in the morning, the car loaded with everything we needed. After a long drive, we finally arrived and decided to take a walk and to enjoy this fresh air. After about an hour of walking, we passed a small group of people on the trail. They were a little older than us. They didn't say much, just nodded as we walked by. A few minutes later, as we continued down the path, we stumbled upon something odd. Scattered across the forest floor, there was someone's camping gear, tents, bags, and supplies just lying there as if abandoned. The tent was partially collapsed, and the rest of the gear looked untouched. There were no signs of anyone around. It was like whoever had been camping here just left everything behind for some reason. That was pretty weird. We stood there for a moment, confused. It didn't make sense. Why would someone leave all their stuff behind? We called out, but no one answered. The woods were silent except for the rustle of the leaves in the wind. We kept moving, pushing the strange discovery out of our minds, and finally reached our campsite by the edge of a small clearing. We set up our tents, made a fire, and settled in for the night. The woods were quiet, and the fire crackled softly as we ate and talked. While all the others were asleep, I was still awake for some reason. I felt some nervousness. Then, after a while, I heard some footsteps, and they were coming closer and closer. I quietly woke up others. They got mad. I woke them up, and then suddenly, a voice came from just outside our tents. "You need to leave," the voice said. "Now, before it's too late." We were frozen in place. None of us responded. The footsteps paused for a moment, and then the voice came again, more urgent this time. "Get out of here. Leave while you can." None of us could recognize the voice, but by his voice I could tell he wasn't joking. We didn't dare open the tent flap to see who it was. The footsteps then disappeared into the forest. None of us slept that night. We lay awake, figuring out what to do. As soon as the morning came, we packed up and left as fast as we could. We didn't speak much as we hiked back to the car, our nerves still on edge. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful when we arrived, now felt hostile. We never found out who or what that was,